All right, so welcome back to Motivation Library. Today we are going to do a deep dive into a book that's been, sparking controversy, I guess is the way to put it, for decades.
Yeah.
Esther Vilar's The End of Manipulation. I'm just going to come right out and say it. Vilar's perspective is bold.
Yes.
To say the least.
Yeah.
And you might find yourself like, what is she talking about?
For sure.
But that's exactly why we're diving in, right?
Exactly.
To explore her ideas, unpack them, challenge our own assumptions along the way.
Yeah, and just understand where she's coming from. Like you said, not necessarily endorsing any of these viewpoints, but it's important to understand them. And I think that's what she's trying to get across too. It's like just to get people thinking.
For sure.
So it's not just like a prescription necessarily for how society should be, but just kind of like shaking people up a little bit.
Yeah.
Getting them to kind of question what they think they know.
Yeah. And she does that in her book, The End of Manipulation, by making a pretty radical claim that there is a hidden power structure.
Yes.
Where women hold the reins and men are essentially living a life sentence of servitude.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Constantly working to please women. A life sentence. Wow, that's heavy.
It's pretty intense imagery for sure, but she kind of doubles down on it.
Yeah, can you unpack that a little bit more? What do you mean a life sentence? Like, what is she talking about?
So the imagery that she uses in the book is that men are granted brief furloughs from their prison.
Oh, okay.
And the prison being work and the furlough is to go home to their families.
Oh, I see.
But then it's back to the prison.
Right.
So it's just this kind of like cyclical, you're either at work, which is your prison, or you're at home, which is your
obligation to your family.
Obligation to your family, exactly.
Okay.
So it's kind of like you're always serving somebody.
So it's not just like working a 9 to 5, it's this like deeper societal...
Exactly. It's a much deeper societal expectation on men.
Expectation. Yeah, okay.
And she goes so far as to compare men to prostitutes in a way.
Oh.
In that they are selling their talents, their time, their thoughts, all for female approval.
What's the underlying point that she's making there?
I think she's trying to highlight what she sees as like a transactional nature to the relationship
I see.
between men and women, and saying that like men are kind of conditioned to believe that their worth is tied to their ability to provide and succeed, and that makes them just constantly trying to seek female approval.
So they're getting validation.
They're getting validation
through their work. Okay, I'm starting to see the picture here. But it's interesting because it almost seems to contradict the fact that men... Right?
Right.
I mean, historically have held most positions of power. Men dominate of politics and business. I mean, really in a lot of families.
Yeah, so that's where it gets really interesting because she addresses this head on.
Yeah.
She's like, okay, yeah, they might hold the political offices, but they're politically disempowered by women.
Well, then how does that work? It sounds like she's saying men are basically puppets controlled by women.
Yeah, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. She uses examples, for instance, like military conscription or alimony laws, and says that these systems, they might on the surface seem to benefit men,
right? But
they actually end up serving women's interests.
So she's saying, like, for instance, mandatory military service. She's saying it's about protecting women.
Yes.
Not necessarily about, national defense or patriotism.
Exactly. And that men are conditioned to be protectors.
Yeah.
And so that leads them to make decisions.
Because that's how they were raised.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is like from birth, basically ingrained into them.
Okay. So I'm starting to see how her arguments connect here.
Yeah.
But this all ties into a much bigger point that she makes, right?
Yes.
About female oppression basically being a myth.
Yeah, that's a big one.
That's a big one. Okay. So she's taking aim at widely accepted beliefs about like the gender pay gap and discrimination
exactly.
in the workplace.
All the hot button issues, basically.
Right. And she's diving into specific examples that challenge the conventional wisdom around these.
Yes, she does.
So what kind of examples? Like what's her take on the gender pay gap, for instance?
Well, she doesn't deny that a gap exists, but she attributes it to things like career choices,
Okay.
work hours, risk tolerance.
Interesting.
So she says that women, for instance, often prioritizing family and work-life balance, may opt for careers that offer more flexibility, even if they come with lower salaries.
Okay.
And men, they might be more likely to take on high-risk, high-reward jobs, which contributes to the disparity.
So she's not saying that women are inherently paid less for the same work.
Right.
She's saying there are other factors at play.
Exactly. She's saying there are other factors at play. And it's, you can agree or disagree with that. But it's an interesting thing to consider.
Yeah.
You know, when you think about all the complexities of these issues, it's not just like a finger-pointing thing like, oh, it's because of discrimination.
Yeah, it's interesting because even the language we use, gender pay gap,
Yeah.
it already frames it as this inherent injustice, right?
Right.
And she seems to be suggesting that it's more complicated than that.
Exactly.
And this all feeds into her very radical, I guess, solution or proposition.
Yeah.
A 5-hour workday.
A 5-hour workday.
For both men and women.
For both men and women. And that's something I think we can both get behind.
I think everybody listening is probably like, oh yeah.
I'll take that.
Sign me up.
Yeah. But how would that even work in the real world? I mean, is this just like a personal choice that you make, or is she talking about like a societal?
She's talking about a societal shift.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And she argues that this reduction in working hours would lead to increased productivity, better overall well-being, and importantly, a more equitable distribution of labor.
Oh. So she's not just talking about like, you know, just like working less and having more time for yourself.
Right.
She's saying that like this would actually change the way society functions. Yeah, she thinks it would force us to reevaluate our priorities as a society, like how much of our identity is tied to our work. And whether, you know, a shorter workday could actually lead to a more fulfilling life.
Yeah. Imagine if you had, an extra 4 or 5 hours in your day.
Yeah, what would you do?
What would I do? What would you do?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it really makes you think, right, about how much time we dedicate to work.
Sure.
Whether it's truly aligned with our values. Like, are we really getting something out of it? I mean, I know we have to work to survive and put food on the table and all that stuff, but
Yeah.
it's like, are we really living?
Right.
Okay, so we've got men working a life sentence.
Right.
We've got this radical proposal of a 5-hour workday.
Yeah.
And we've got this challenge to the very notion of female oppression. What else? I mean, what else does she explore in this book?
So another big one is how she sees gender roles as being completely constructed.
Yeah.
So she argues that the current system forces men to adopt this very narrow definition of masculinity, focused primarily on work and achievement and providing for others.
And she believes this is limiting in some way.
She thinks it's incredibly limiting.
Okay.
She argues that this pressure to conform to that kind of masculinity prevents men from fully experiencing their emotions, from pursuing their own desires and interests. And she even says that women get to pick and choose the most desirable traits, and men are left to embody all the less appealing ones.
So if traditional masculinity is this prison, as she puts it, what kind of freedom is she envisioning?
That is a great question, and one that we will delve into as we continue our deep dive into the end of manipulation. Picking up where we left off, let's delve a little deeper into Vilar's perspective on this prison of traditional masculinity.
Okay.
She argues that this prescribed role really limits men's emotional range, forces them to suppress their true selves.
So what does she mean by suppressing their true selves? Like, give me an example. What's she talking about?
So she argues that men are often discouraged from expressing vulnerability or sensitivity or even emotional depth. They're expected to be stoic, strong, always in control. And this emotional suppression, she believes, leads to a disconnect from their authentic selves and ultimately hinders their personal growth and well-being.
So it's not just about like external pressures, right? It's almost like an internalized sense of what it means to be a man.
Exactly. She suggests that this internalized pressure can be even more powerful than external expectations.
Interesting.
It becomes a self-imposed limitation that prevents men from fully embracing their humanity.
It's interesting if we connect this back to her point about men being prostitutes, right?
Yeah.
It seems like she's drawing a parallel between this emotional suppression and the way that men sell their time and their talents for validation.
That's a great connection. I think she is saying that this need for validation stems from this very suppression.
Interesting.
By denying themselves emotional freedom, men become dependent on these external sources of approval, particularly from women.
So they're almost trapped in this vicious cycle where they suppress their emotions to conform to these societal expectations and then seek validation to fill the void that's created by that suppression.
Exactly. And this perpetuates a system where men are constantly striving to prove their worth, often at the expense of their own well-being.
So let's say we buy into Vilar's critique, right, of traditional masculinity.
Yeah.
What's the alternative? What kind of freedom is she envisioning?
So she kind of envisions a world where men are free to express their full range of emotions, to prioritize personal fulfillment alongside professional success, and to engage in relationships that are based on mutual respect and understanding rather than these societal expectations.
So it's about breaking free from these rigid definitions of what it means to be a man, right? Allowing men to kind of define themselves on their own terms.
Exactly. It's about embracing individuality and allowing men to be their authentic selves.
And this brings us back to her radical proposal of a 5-hour workday. Do you think that could play a role in achieving this kind of freedom for men?
Absolutely. I think she believes that a shorter workday would free up time and mental space for men to pursue their passions, explore their emotions, develop a stronger sense of self outside of work.
It makes sense. I mean, if you're not spending, the majority of your waking hours grinding away at a job, you might have more energy and motivation to invest in your personal growth and your self-discovery.
Exactly. It could be a catalyst for a major shift in perspective, allowing men to redefine their priorities, break free from this life sentence that she describes.
But wouldn't a shorter workday also have implications for women?
For sure.
I mean, it seems like she's suggesting that it would force them to become more economically independent.
That's right. She argues that a 5-hour workday would disrupt this traditional model where men are the primary breadwinners, and women would no longer be able to solely rely on men for financial support. So they would be incentivized to pursue their own careers and become more self-sufficient.
So do you think this shift towards female economic independence would be a positive thing?
Well, she certainly believes so. She sees it as a necessary step towards achieving true equality between men and women.
Okay.
By breaking free from financial dependence, women would gain greater autonomy and agency in their lives and their relationships.
But wouldn't this also lead to a more competitive, individualistic society?
Yeah, that's a good point. You have to kind of weigh that. Like, would we lose a sense of community, shared responsibility? Would it lead to greater isolation and inequality? These are all valid questions.
It's almost like she's presenting us with a trade-off. Greater individual freedom, but maybe a weakening of social bonds.
Right. It's a really complex issue. But I think her point is that the current system, with its rigid gender roles, these economic dependencies, is unsustainable in the long run. So she's proposing this radical alternative, one that might seem disruptive, but could ultimately lead to a more just and equitable society.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to dig into another kind of controversial aspect of her book.
Sure.
Her take on this myth of female oppression. Specifically, her perspective on the gender pay gap really struck me.
Yeah, it's definitely a thought-provoking argument.
For sure.
Remember, she doesn't deny the existence of a pay gap between men and women, but she challenges the prevailing narrative that it's solely the result of systemic discrimination or sexism.
So if it's not just about discrimination, what else is contributing to this gap, according to her?
So she points to a number of factors, including career choices, work hours, risk tolerance.
Okay.
So for example, she argues that women, often prioritizing family and work-life balance, may gravitate towards careers that offer greater flexibility, even if those careers typically come with lower salaries.
So she's suggesting that it's not always about being paid less for the same work. It's about the types of work that men and women typically choose.
Exactly. And she also argues that men statistically are more likely to take on high-risk, high-reward jobs, which can contribute to higher earnings over time.
It's interesting because it challenges the assumption that every instance of a woman earning less than a man in a similar role is automatically a case of discrimination.
Exactly. She's encouraging us to look beyond the simplistic narrative of victimhood and consider this complex interplay of individual choices, societal expectations, economic forces that contribute to the gap.
It's a reminder that these issues are rarely black and white.
Yeah,
There are often multiple perspectives to consider.
absolutely.
It's important to note that her views on the gender pay gap have been met with a lot of criticism.
No, for sure.
Some argue that she downplays the role of discrimination, overlooks the systemic barriers that women face in the workplace.
Yeah,
So it's not like a universally accepted perspective. There are valid counterarguments to consider.
for sure.
But even if you disagree with her conclusions, her arguments force us to engage in this more nuanced discussion about the gender pay gap and the potential solutions beyond simply demanding equal pay.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's about having an open mind and being willing to consider different perspectives, even if they challenge your, preconceived notions.
Yeah.
Now, another area where Vilar really stirs the pot is in her discussion of this female non-work.
Right.
specifically housework and childcare.
Ooh, this is where things get spicy.
Yeah. So what's her take on this whole, women's work narrative?
So she argues that the amount of time and effort traditionally associated with housework and childcare has been significantly reduced
Huh.
due to, technological advancements, changes in lifestyle. And she suggests that women often exaggerate the burden of these tasks, perpetuating this narrative of sacrifice and martyrdom.
So she's saying that the image of the exhausted housewife slaving away at home while her husband works is outdated.
That's essentially her argument. She even goes so far as to compare housework to hobbies, arguing that women often engage in these activities for personal fulfillment rather than out of necessity.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
But what about the emotional labor involved in raising children, managing a household? Surely that counts as work, right?
She acknowledges that raising children and maintaining a home can be emotionally demanding. However, she argues that these tasks are also inherently rewarding and that women benefit from the societal recognition and appreciation that's associated with motherhood and domesticity.
So she's saying that, while it can be challenging, it's not necessarily a burden, and women actually derive satisfaction from these roles.
That's one way to interpret her argument. She's essentially challenging this assumption that housework and childcare are inherently oppressive or exploitative.
It's definitely a different way of looking at it.
Right.
Now, I'm curious to know how this ties into her overall critique of the dynamics between men and women. Is she suggesting that women use housework and childcare as a form of manipulation?
That is a great question, and one that we will explore further as we continue our deep dive into the end of manipulation. All right, so we've unpacked a lot of Vilar's pretty controversial ideas.
Yeah.
The life sentence of men, the 5-hour workday, the myth of female oppression.
Yeah.
And now we're kind of getting to the heart of it.
Yeah.
Her take on relationships, particularly marriage.
This is where she really, I think, pushes the boundaries, right?
Yeah.
She seems to see marriage, at least as it exists now in our society, as a system that's designed to trap men.
Yeah.
Essentially securing their economic resources while limiting their freedom.
Yeah, she really goes there.
Yeah, okay, so I can see how that might ruffle some feathers.
Oh, yeah.
What's the basis of her argument? I mean, why does she think women would want to trap men in this way?
So she believes it's all tied back to what she sees as this biological imperative for women to find a provider for themselves and their children.
Right.
And she argues that consciously or unconsciously, women use a combination of societal pressure and emotional strategy to kind of manipulate men into marriage.
So she's not saying that every woman is consciously setting out to deceive a man into marriage.
Right.
She's saying that these societal and biological forces are kind of at play.
Exactly. And she even goes as far as to compare women to salespeople using their charm and femininity to close the deal.
Wow. That's a pretty harsh analogy.
Yeah, it is.
But is she saying that there's no love and affection? Those play no role in this?
She doesn't deny that love can exist within a marriage.
Yeah.
But she argues that it's often secondary to this underlying motivation of economic security.
So she sees marriage as a transaction.
Essentially.
Where men provide financial stability and women provide companionship and domestic services.
That's how she sees it.
I'm hearing this and I'm thinking about, you see countless examples of couples who seem genuinely in love, who support each other emotionally and financially.
Sure.
Does she address those kinds of relationships?
So she acknowledges that these seemingly egalitarian relationships exist.
Okay.
But she maintains that even in those cases, there's still this power imbalance that persists.
Really?
And she believes that women, by virtue of their ability to control the domestic sphere, right, and manipulate emotions, still hold a certain level of control within the relationship.
So even if a couple splits chores and finances equally, she's saying there's still this underlying power dynamic.
That's her argument. It's definitely thought-provoking, even if you don't totally buy into it.
It's interesting.
It challenges us to think about the subtle ways that power dynamics can manifest in relationships, even those that appear balanced on the surface.
And what about children? Where do they fit into this whole view of marriage?
So she sees children as a way for women to solidify their control within a marriage.
Okay.
And secure their financial future.
I see.
And she argues that women often pressure men into having children, even when they may not be ready, as a way to cement the commitment and increase those financial obligations.
That's a pretty bleak view of motherhood.
Yeah.
I mean, does she believe that women don't genuinely desire to have children or experience the joys of parenthood?
She doesn't explicitly deny the emotional aspect of motherhood,
Okay.
but she suggests that it's often intertwined with this underlying drive for security and control within the relationship.
Interesting.
She even goes as far as to say that women can weaponize children
Wow.
during divorce proceedings, using them as leverage to secure favorable custody arrangements and financial settlements.
That's a pretty heavy accusation.
Yeah, it's definitely going to spark some debate.
It seems like she's painting a very cynical picture of both marriage and motherhood.
Right.
These institutions that are often idealized in our society.
Absolutely.
So it's important to acknowledge that her views are extremely controversial
Yeah.
and challenge these very deeply held beliefs about love and family and the roles of men and women.
Right.
But even if you find her conclusions to be extreme, her arguments, I think, can still be valuable
For sure.
in prompting critical thinking about these complex topics.
Yeah.
So if she sees marriage and these traditional family structures as inherently flawed,
Right.
does she offer any alternatives? Like, what does she propose?
So she doesn't explicitly propose an alternative to marriage.
Okay.
But she advocates for greater economic independence for women.
Okay.
She believes that that would fundamentally shift the power dynamics within relationships, allow for greater equality and genuine partnership.
That makes sense, because if women are not financially reliant on men,
Right.
they're less likely to feel pressured into marriage or to stay in relationships that are not fulfilling.
Exactly.
Right.
And she also emphasizes the importance of personal fulfillment for both men and women.
Yeah.
And her radical proposal of a 5-hour workday ties into this idea, right?
Right.
It's about creating space for individuals to pursue their own passions, to explore their identities,
Right.
to build meaningful relationships based on shared values, not just economic necessity.
So it's not about tearing down marriage or family altogether, but about reimagining them
Yeah,
based on mutual respect and shared responsibility and individual fulfillment.
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Her work is ultimately a call to question the status quo,
Yeah.
to examine these underlying power dynamics that shape our relationships and our institutions, and to imagine a future where men and women can relate to each other as genuine equals.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Mm.
Yeah, we have.
Into Esther Vilar's The End of Manipulation.
Lots to think about.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride filled with, these thought-provoking arguments, controversial perspectives, maybe even a few moments of discomfort for listeners.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of exploring these challenging ideas.
For sure.
They force us to confront our own beliefs,
Yeah.
expand our understanding, maybe even rethink the way we see the world.
And it's exactly what we hope to achieve here at Motivation Library.
Yeah.
Spark conversation, challenge assumptions,
Gets you thinking?
inspire you to think critically and creatively.
Absolutely. So we're throwing it back to you, our incredible listeners.
Yes.
What stood out to you in this deep dive?
Yeah, let us know.
Do you agree with Vilar's assessment of the power dynamics between men and women?
Yeah, how might a 5-hour workday transform your life and your relationship?
And what does masculinity and femininity even mean in today's world?
Yeah.
Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Yes.
And let's keep this conversation going. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. And remember,
There's always more to explore.
in the Motivation Library.